I didn't buy the double M for the land or the house or even the dream of a simpler life. I bought it because of the wind. The wind out there in that forgotten valley doesn't just whistle or howl. It speaks. It carries the scent of dust and creosote, of dry earth baking in a sun that feels older than time itself. It whispers stories you can almost understand, of cattle drives and gold rushes, of broken fences and broken hearts. It's a lonely sound, but an honest one. The price tag of a single dollar was a punchline to a joke no one in town was telling. They said the place was cursed. They said it was too far gone, that the buildings would collapse if you sneezed too hard, and that the water rights were a legal nightmare. They were right about the buildings, about the water too, but they were wrong about the curse. There was no curse. There was only a man, a cowboy older than the hills, who had made a pact with the land and had no intention of breaking it. When I signed the deed and drove my beaten-up truck through the rusted gate, I thought I was buying a project. I didn't realize I was walking into a legacy. The hinges of the main gate screamed, a sound of tortured metal that echoed across the empty valley and was swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. It felt like the ranch itself was protesting my arrival. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and told myself it was just the wind that was already starting to feel less like a friend and more like a harbinger. My name is Elias Thorne. Back then, I was a man running from the acrid smell of antiseptic and the beeping of machines in a city hospital. I had buried my wife, Clara, 6 months earlier, and the silence of our apartment had become a physical weight I couldn't carry anymore. I was an architect, a creator of ordered spaces, but my own life had become a chaotic mess of grief and unfinished sentences. The ad for the double M, for sale, $1, a hand-hewn dream in need of a lover's touch, had felt like a sign pointing toward a new kind of quiet, a more bearable kind of emptiness. The house was exactly as advertised, a relic, a 2-story wooden structure with a porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. The paint had long since surrendered to the sun and wind, leaving behind a pale, weathered gray, the color of bones. The windows stared back at me, blank and unseeing, like the eyes of a corpse. I had planned to assess the damage, sleep in the truck if I had to, and start the overwhelming process of rebuilding in the morning. The first thing I noticed was the faint smell of wood smoke. It was there, curling through the smell of dust and decay, as stubborn and out of place as a wildflower in a gravel pit. I dismissed it as a draft from the old chimney, maybe a remnant from the last owner a year ago. It was a foolish, hopeful assumption, the kind a city-bred fool makes when confronting the wilderness. I pried open the front door, which groaned but held. Sunlight sliced into the dim interior, illuminating dancing motes of dust. The main room was a monument to neglect. The floorboards were warped. A layer of grit and dead leaves had blown in from somewhere. A heavy, silent stillness enveloped everything. But again I smelled it, stronger now. It wasn't just an old fire, it was a recent one, the scent sharp and a little sweet, the smell of dry pinon. Then I saw the boots. They were placed neatly by the cold, soot-blackened hearth, old, worn leather the color of dried blood. The soles were caked with dried mud that had turned to a pale, dusty crust. They were so deliberately placed that it was unsettling. They weren't trash, they were a statement. They were an offering. My mind, still sluggish from the long drive and the weight of my own sorrow, struggled to process it. Someone was squatting. A drifter, maybe. A transient who had found a dry place to sleep. A slow, almost imperceptible movement caught the corner of my eye. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wasn't alone. A man, or at least the shape of a man, was sitting perfectly still in the deep shadows of a corner, at a rough-hewn wooden table. He was so still he could have been a piece of the furniture, a pile of old, discarded clothing and shadow. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape solidified into a figure. A broad-brimmed hat cast his face into complete darkness, but I saw the blue-gray outline of a denim jacket, and the glint of a long, silver ponytail that fell over a shoulder. He hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched. He was just watching me. My first instinct was to run, to bolt for the truck and get the hell out of there. But there was a strange, magnetic quality to his stillness. He didn't seem threatening, not in an aggressive way. He seemed patient, like a predator who had all the time in the world. "I bought this place," I finally stammered, my voice sounding small and pathetic in the vast, dusty room. "I have the deed, it's mine." Silence. The only reply was the dust settling and the whistle of the wind through a crack in the wall. Then he shifted. It was a tiny motion, but it was enough to make me flinch. "Mister," a voice rumbled out of the darkness. It was a voice that sounded like it had been aged in a barrel of whiskey and rolled in sand, deep, weathered, and patient. "You bought a piece of paper, you didn't buy this." He lifted a hand and made a slow, sweeping gesture that encompassed the room, the dust, the peeling wallpaper, and the very air we were breathing. "This don't belong to any man." He seemed to have no weapon, no visible sign of hostility. He just sat there, a shadow in the corner of his own castle. As my eyes adjusted further, I could see him more clearly. His hands resting on the table were gnarled and brown, etched with a million tiny lines and scars. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, a map of hardship, and his eyes, they were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray. They held no anger, no fear, just a deep, unyielding certainty. "Look," I said, trying to inject authority into my voice, "I know this is a shock, but I have the title. I can call the sheriff. I don't want any trouble, but—" He cut me off with a soft, breathy laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was a sound of genuine amusement, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and deeply resigned. "Sheriff. Bud Holcomb's son is the sheriff. That boy couldn't find his own ass with both hands and a map. And he sure as hell won't come out here to tell a man he's gotta leave a place he's lived in for 70 years. 70 years. The number hung in the air between us. It wasn't just a squatter. This was something else entirely. "Who are you?" I whispered, my question more for myself than for him. "I'm Elias. I didn't know, the ad didn't say anyone was living here. The realtor, the lawyer, no one mentioned you." He leaned back slightly, and the light from the door caught his face just enough to reveal the ghost of a smile. It was a smile that was both kind and tragic, like he was laughing at a joke only he understood. "I told him to leave me out of it. They figured if they made enough noise about the legalities, the sale would fall through and I'd just keep on keeping on. They were right for a while, but you came along." He nodded slowly, sizing me up. "You must be a stubborn son of a bitch, driving out here alone." "That's either very stupid or very brave. Usually it's both." His words, simple and matter-of-fact, were a bucket of cold water. The realtors, the lawyers, they had known. They had known about him and they had kept quiet, hopping to just wash their hands of the whole troublesome deal. I was a fool, the final mark in a long-running con. He introduced himself not with a handshake but with a simple statement. "My name's Ben. You can call me that. Just Ben. I was born in this house, in that room right there." He pointed a gnarled finger toward a closed door. "My daddy, he built this place with his own 2 hands. Bought the lumber from a mill in the next county, hauled it over here in a wagon pulled by 2 mules named Hattie and Jim. This here, Elias, is the only home I have ever known, and I'm gonna die here. That's a promise I made to my wife, Mary. She's buried just out back. I promised her I'd see the sun set and rise over this valley every day until I couldn't do it anymore." He paused, his winter gray eyes meeting mine with unwavering intensity. "I don't aim to break that promise." That was the moment the weight of what I had walked into fully hit me. This wasn't a legal dispute. This wasn't a trespassing issue. This was a matter of the soul. This man was a living artifact, a part of the very land I had just paid $1 for. You can't legally evict a ghost, and Ben, in his way, was more of a presence than a person. He was the embodiment of the double M. He rose slowly, stiffly, and the sound of his joints popping was the only thing that broke the silence. He walked to the hearth, his movements deliberate, and put another piece of split piñon on the coals. The flames licked up, casting his gaunt frame into sharp, dancing relief. "You hungry?" he asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I got a pot of beans on, been slow cooking all day." This was not how you talk to a man who's legally squatting on your property. You yell, you threaten, you call the cops, but my city-bred scripts were useless here. In his world, you shared the fire, you shared the food, you shared the silence, and then maybe you figured things out. I sank onto a dusty chair, the defeat heavy in my bones. I nodded, and he handed me a chipped tin bowl filled with a simple, savory bean stew. We ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the scrape of our spoons against the tin. It was the most profound and strangest meal I had ever had. I had come to bury my grief in a project of wood and nails. Instead, I had stumbled into a living wake, presided over by the deceased's most loyal mourner. The days that followed were a strange, silent negotiation. I didn't leave, and Ben didn't ask me to. The house, which I had planned to dissect and rebuild, became a shared space. We were two strangers, connected by the same roof and a deep, unspoken loneliness. Sleep came reluctantly for me. The first night, I'd laid out my sleeping bag on the floor of what was likely once the master bedroom, the one that had been Ben's. The old wooden bed frame was still there, a skeletal structure without a mattress. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in it. It felt like a violation. My sleep was fitful, haunted by the unfamiliar creaks and groans of a house settling, or maybe it was ghosts. I'd drift off, then be jolted awake by a sound, a board flexing, a mouse skittering, or the soft, distant hoot of an owl. In contrast, Ben slept in a small room off the kitchen. He converted it into a sort of den. His bed was a simple cot with a thick wool blanket. At night, I'd see the faint, flickering light of a kerosene lamp burning low through the cracked door, and hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound that was somehow more comforting than the city's silence. A routine emerged. We didn't plan it, it just happened. It was a routine born of necessity and two very different types of stubbornness. In the mornings, I'd often wake to the sound of Ben moving around the kitchen. He'd start a fire in the big cast-iron stove, and the smell of strong coffee would fill the house. I'd stumble out and he'd wordlessly pour me a cup. We'd sit on the porch, watching the sun burn away the morning mist in the valley, our breath steaming in the cold air. He moved with a slow, mechanical grace, driven by a lifetime of habit. He'd tend to his small, fenced-in garden plot behind the house, where he grew tomatoes, peppers, and a few hardy herbs. His hands, as gnarled as old roots, would delicately feel the soil, checking for moisture or carefully prune a plant. He never used a phone, had no television. His entertainment was his garden, the sky, and an old wind-up radio that he'd listen to at night for a few minutes, just to catch a scrap of music. My role was the observer. I was a man whose entire professional life was about building structures, and yet this man was showing me a more profound kind of construction, the building of a life in harmony with a place. He gave me a task, though. "There's a fence line," he said one afternoon, pointing a bony finger towards a distant ridge. "It used to run the whole north side. The cattle's all gone, but the fence is down in a dozen places. I can't get to it all anymore. If you're gonna stay, you're gonna earn your keep." It was manual labor, sweaty, frustrating, and endlessly slow work. I had to drive the truck, which was older than I was, out to the fence line with a roll of wire and a handful of rusty tools. It was hard, honest work. My hands, accustomed to sketching and drafting, quickly became blistered and raw. My back ached from the relentless stooping and pulling. For the first time in months, my mind was blessedly blank, occupied only by the simple, physical task of mending. I'd find snapped posts, rotted in the ground, and have to dig them out and replace them. The silence of the valley was my companion, broken only by the clang of my hammer and the occasional buzz of a fly. This was when the real education began. I learned to see the ranch through Ben's eyes. He wasn't a hermit hiding from the world. He was a steward. He maintained the property not with an eye for profit or aesthetics, but with the precision of a man preserving a memory. One afternoon, I was struggling to fix a particularly stubborn section of wire. The sun was a hammer beating down on my neck. Ben appeared, a dark silhouette against the brilliant blue sky. He didn't speak at first. He just watched. Then he came over, knelt stiffly on the ground beside me, and showed me a trick to twisting the wire around the post. He'd learned it from his father, he said, who'd learned it from a Navajo man who taught him to trade. The technique, he explained with a quiet pride, wasn't about strength. It was about the angle and the patience. There's a right way and a wrong way to do most things, Elias, he'd say, his voice low, his eyes fixed on his work. Most folks, they just want it done quick. They don't care about the how. But the how is everything. You do it right, it'll last 50 years. You do it quick, it'll be broke again by next spring, and you'll have to do it all over again. He wasn't just teaching me how to mend a fence. He was teaching me a philosophy. He was teaching me that the value was in the doing, in the connection to the land. The hours I spent mending that fence felt like a meditation, a slow, deliberate process that healed something in me. The blisters were a worthy price. The moments of connection were quiet and fleeting. One evening he was telling me about a blizzard that hit in 1948. He was just a boy. It was the worst one I ever saw, he said, his eyes distant, focused on the past. Snow came up to the roof. My father and I dug tunnels to the barn so the animals wouldn't freeze. We ran out of wood, so we burned the kitchen table. It lasted for 8 days. 8 days of just white, of not knowing if the sun would ever come back. He shook his head, the memory as vivid as if it were yesterday. Those were hard times, but you know what? We didn't complain. We didn't have the time. We were too busy surviving. Another time he spoke of Mary, his wife. It was late and the fire was burning low. His voice was soft, almost inaudible over the crackling embers. She was a school teacher, you know, came out here to teach in the one-room schoolhouse over in the next county. I saw her at a church social and I was a goner. She was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, had a laugh like a wind chime. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. We were married for 53 years. Cancer got her in the end. I held her hand in this very room while the sun went down. I promised her I'd keep the place up. That's what I've been doing. It was a simple story, told in simple words, but the love and loss behind it were so profound that I felt a physical ache in my chest. It was a story that mirrored my own grief, but amplified by a lifetime of shared experiences. Here was a man who had not only lost his wife, but had also lost the world he knew. The town had died, the children had moved away, and the only thing left was the echo of a life lived fully. My grief for Clara was a sharp, fresh wound. His grief was an old, scarred-over wound that ached with the changing weather. Our relationship was a strange one. He didn't ask about Clara. He didn't need to. He could see the loss in the way I held myself, the way I stared blankly at the horizon. There were no tearful confessions, no deep emotional talks, just a shared silence, a shared meal, and a shared purpose. We were a strange, makeshift family, united by our brokenness and a desire to find meaning in a piece of land that had seen so much. One evening I made a crack about the house falling down if we sneezed too hard. "You think it's a wreck now," he said, a wry smile on his lips. "You should have seen it after the fire in '68. We were lucky the whole valley didn't burn down." His tone was not self-pitying but matter-of-fact. It was a part of life. You rebuilt. I began to see that his entire existence was a testament to endurance. He was a man who had been battered by life, by the elements, by loss, by the loneliness of a dying town, and he had simply refused to break. His resilience wasn't loud or showy. It was a quiet, stubborn persistence, a daily act of will. Every time he got up to feed the chickens or water his garden, he was giving the middle finger to the world. It was a protest not with words, but with existence itself. I, on the other hand, was a man who had broken. The death of my wife had shattered the careful, ordered world I had built for myself. I was a ghost, drifting aimlessly, searching for a safe harbor. Ben's silent strength was a lifeline. He wasn't trying to teach me or fix me. He was simply being himself, and that act of being was enough to show me a path forward. The forgotten part of the title was a grim joke. The land didn't forget. Every shrub, every rock, every gust of wind had a memory. And the biggest memory, the one Ben was so desperately clinging to, was a promise. As the weeks bled into a month and my hands grew calloused and my back grew stronger, the tension between us quietly shifted. It was no longer a question of ownership or eviction. It was a negotiation of a different kind, a negotiation of the heart. I had the deed, the legal right. He had the soul, the rightful claim. The change began one morning when I was looking over the county survey maps I'd brought. I found the original homestead claim, dated 1887. The ink was faded, but the signature was clear. Benjamin Blackjack Miller, Ben's grandfather. He wasn't just a squatter, he was a legacy. I traced the boundaries of the double M, noting the spring, the creek bed, the line of ancient oaks. It was a treasure map to a world that no longer existed. "I could help you," I said to him that evening, not as a concession but as a genuine offer. "Maybe we could make some repairs to the house together. I can get materials, fix up that collapsed barn, turn this place into something again." Ben was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the flames. "You want to rebuild a house," he said slowly, "but you can't rebuild a world. That's what you're trying to do, isn't it? You're trying to rebuild a life by rebuilding this one. You think if you fix the roof and paint the walls, the ghosts will go away." He was too perceptive. He saw right through me, right into the heart of my own desperate, unacknowledged plan. He wasn't just talking about the ranch. He was talking about me. I wanted to reconstruct the double M just as I wanted to reconstruct the life I had lost with Clara. I was an architect, a builder. It was my default mode. He saw the truth before I did. "Mary and we tried to get a loan to fix up the place back in '85, he continued, his voice low and weary. "They wouldn't give it to us, said the value was too low. A bank sees a piece of property. I see my home. They can't understand that." He shook his head. "You can't fix what's broken with a loan and a hammer. Some things just have to be accepted. The land is like that. It'll take what you give it, but it won't be something it's not." His words were a quiet revelation. The ranch wasn't a project. It was a testament to what was lost. To try to rebuild it into something modern, something better, would be to erase its history, to deny the truth of what had happened here. It was a monument to a way of life that had died, and Ben was its lone caretaker. I started to let go of my architectural plans. Instead of measuring and drawing, I just watched and listened. I learned to read the land. I learned that a certain pattern of clouds meant rain was coming in 2 days, and that the crows always gathered near the spring before a storm. I learned to find the subtle path of an ancient trail that had once led to a neighbor's ranch, now only visible by the slightly different color of the grass. One afternoon, a fierce windstorm kicked up. We were on the porch, watching the dust devils dance across the valley. A loose shutter from the second story began banging violently against the house. "Don't worry about it," Ben said, calm as a stone. "It's just the wind. It'll pass. That shutter's been loose for 40 years. 40 years. It was a jolt. I was a man who would have dropped everything to fix that shutter the moment I saw it rattle. To Ben, it was part of the house, a quirk, a voice. He didn't care about perfection. He cared about persistence. It was a lesson in choosing your battles. That's when the real negotiation began. I had the power to make him leave. I could go to the county, enforce the eviction. But the thought filled me with a profound sense of shame. It would be like evicting the valley itself. And what would I do with the place? What would be the point? I had come here to build a new life, but Ben was showing me that the most meaningful life often comes from preserving the old. I realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that this was the decision I had been avoiding. I could either embrace my role as the new owner and force Ben out, or I could accept the truth. Ben was the soul of the double M, I was just the caretaker of the paperwork. A few days later, I was working on a section of the porch that was rotten. It was a small job, one that wouldn't change the overall character of the place. I was hammering in a new board when Ben walked up. "Your wife," he said, his voice neutral. He didn't look at me. "What was her name?" It was the first time he'd asked. The question, so direct, so out of the blue, hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped hammering, my hand trembling. Clara, I whispered. I hadn't spoken her name aloud in this place. He nodded slowly. You loved her a lot. I still do. He was silent again for a long time. That's good, he said finally, his voice soft. That's the important thing, it don't ever go away. The love, I mean, it just changes. It becomes part of the landscape, it stays with you. It's like my Mary. She's not here anymore, but she is. She's in that rose bush I planted for her. She's in the way the light hits the valley in the evening. She's part of this place. He turned and limped back into the house. I was left standing there, a hammer in my hand, tears blurring my vision. It wasn't the advice I'd been expecting. It was a gift, an understanding from one broken man to another. He wasn't telling me to get over Clara. He was telling me to accept her as part of the landscape of my life. She had become a part of my double M, a piece of the architecture of my soul. That night I made my decision. I took the deed, the pristine legal piece of paper that had brought me here, and I held it over the fire. The flames licked at the edges. I let it burn, watching the ink curl and disappear, watching the official seal turn to ash. I didn't need it. I had something better. I had the place for as long as it would have me. I wasn't giving up my ownership of the land. I was accepting my place in its history. I was no longer an outsider buying a piece of dirt. I was a caretaker, the student of a man who was the last living chapter of the double M story. My life, from that moment on, was no longer about running or building. It was about learning the language of the wind. Winter came in a slow, creeping siege. The nights grew longer, the air sharper. The silence of the valley became a heavy blanket muffling the world. The wind no longer howled. It moaned, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. For me, it was a time of introspection, of learning the true meaning of isolation. Ben and I hunkered down. We had prepared as best we could. We stocked up on canned goods and split enough firewood to heat a small town. The old house, for all its flaws, held the heat remarkably well. The thick stone walls of the fireplace absorbed the warmth during the day and radiated it back at night. It was our sanctuary against the encroaching cold. Ben grew weaker. It was a slow, inexorable decline. His hands shook more when he poured his coffee. He moved slower, his steps more hesitant. He spent more time sitting in his old armchair by the fire, staring into the flames, his eyes seeing a world I could only imagine. He slept more, too, often drifting off in the middle of a conversation, only to wake with a start, his eyes clouded with confusion before they cleared. He was dying. It was a truth we both knew but refused to articulate. The promise he had made to Mary, to see the sun set and rise over this valley every day, was a promise he was clinging to with the last of his strength. One afternoon, a blizzard hit. It wasn't the gentle, picturesque snow of a postcard. It was a whiteout, a furious assault of wind and ice that erased the world outside the windows. The house groaned under the assault, and the wind found new ways in, whistling through the old timbers. We were prisoners, confined to the small perimeter of the old house. Ben had a bad cough. It was a deep, rattling sound that worried me. He waved away my concern, but his eyes were sunken and tired. "It's just a cold, Elias," he'd rasp. "I've had 1,000 of 'em." But I knew it wasn't just a cold. It was his body failing him, and this was just the final act. The situation escalated quickly. The cough grew worse and a fever set in. He spent most of his time in his cot, shivering despite the piles of blankets I heaped on him. He slipped in and out of consciousness, muttering in his sleep. Sometimes he'd call out for Mary. Other times he'd call for his father or for a horse named Dancer, a name I didn't know. I was terrified. I was a city man, completely out of my element. I had no phone. The roads were impassable. It was just me, a dying old man, and a blizzard that showed no signs of stopping. I felt a surge of helplessness so profound it made me sick to my stomach. "Ben," I said one evening, kneeling beside his cot, "I need to get you help. I have to drive into town." He opened his eyes, and for a moment they were clear and sharp. He looked at me with a kind of pity. You wouldn't make it 5 miles, he said, his voice a mere whisper. You'd get lost in the white, and that would be the end of both of us. You stay here. You stay with me. That's all I need. He reached out a trembling, gnarled hand and took mine. His grip was surprisingly strong, a final spasm of energy. You stay, he repeated. That's an order from your foreman. And so I stayed. I spent the next few days in a state of constant, anxious vigilance. I'd keep the fire fed, bring him soup I'd heated on the stove, and try to get him to drink water. I talked to him, not knowing if he could hear me. I told him about the fence I'd fixed, the way the light hit the valley in the morning. I told him about Clara and how much I missed her. I told him I was scared. I told him I was sorry. The night he died, the wind finally stopped. A profound, deafening silence settled over the valley. The snow had stopped falling and the clouds had parted, revealing a sky filled with more stars than I had ever seen. They were brilliant and cold, like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. Ben opened his eyes. His face was peaceful, his breathing shallow and raspy. "Elias," he whispered. His voice was so faint I had to lean in close to hear him. "I'm here," I said, my own voice choked with emotion. "Take care of the place," he said. "It's just dirt and wood, but it's my dirt and wood. It's—" His sentence trailed off. He looked past me, toward the window, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. A look of profound peace and recognition spread across his weathered face. "Mary," he breathed, his voice filled with a warmth I'd never heard before. "You look so pretty." He took one last, shuddering breath, and then the light in his winter-gray eyes simply went out. He was gone. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. I sat there, holding his hand, for a long time. I didn't feel sad, not in the way I'd expected. I felt a sense of profound awe. I had just witnessed the completion of a life. I buried him the next day next to Mary. The ground was frozen solid, and it took me an entire day to dig a hole deep enough with a pickaxe and shovel. It was the hardest physical labor I'd ever done. My hands bled and my body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. It was a final act of respect, a way of honoring the promise he had kept. Standing over the two graves, the silence of the valley felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of history, full of love, full of loss. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't alone. I was the new foreman of a place where ghosts and memories were the only true currency. Spring eventually came, a slow, tentative thaw. The snow melted, revealing the scarred, muddy earth, and slowly life returned. The first wildflowers emerged, tiny purple and yellow blossoms that seemed impossibly brave. The crows returned, squabbling in the old oaks. The wind began to whisper again. I stayed. I rebuilt the collapsed barn with my own hands. I fixed the leak in the roof. I painted the house a warm, pale yellow, the color Ben's mother had first painted it, a detail he had once mentioned. I didn't do it to change the place. I did it to continue his legacy. I was a caretaker now, a guardian of the story. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set, I saw a herd of wild horses in the distance, silhouetted against the fiery sky. They were moving slowly, majestically, across the valley floor. They were the first horses I had seen on the property. It felt like a blessing, a sign that the land was waking up again. And I thought of Ben. I could almost feel him there, sitting in the old chair beside me. I could almost hear his voice, a low, raspy chuckle on the wind. He was right. The love doesn't go away, it just changes. It becomes part of the landscape. I hadn't bought the double M, I had inherited it in the truest sense of the word. I had inherited a legacy, a duty, and a profound understanding of what it means to belong. The house was no longer just a house. It was a part of me. And the wind, the one that had first called me here, no longer sounded like a cry of loneliness. It sounded like a song of belonging. The last thing I did that night was to put an ad in the local paper. It was simple. It just said, Double M Ranch, now accepting APPLICATIONS for the position of caretaker. I wasn't looking for an employee. I was looking for another broken soul who needed a place to call home, a new chapter in the long story. I thought of the graves out back and the promise they held. The land wouldn't die. It would just change. The wind was still there and it was still waiting.